Hey, I'm Bob and I like to make stuff. Today I'm gonna make double bunk beds. You may remember a while back, one of the first home renovation videos that I did was on this room. This is where my boys sleep, and since I did that renovation, 2 of them have been sleeping on mattresses on the floor. I'm not super proud of that, so I figured it was time for us to make them some bunk beds. It's a pretty large room, but we want to keep it as open as possible, so we're gonna push these beds all the way into the corner and fix them to the wall. I've got a couple of design constraints. The biggest one is the slope of the ceiling. That's gonna force me to lower both of the bunks so that each person has enough room to set up without hitting their head. We've got air returns in the floor we have to work into the bottom frame, and I want each bed to have cubby storage at the headboard. Let's do it. I started with a big pile of 2x6s from the local home center and got to the chop saw to cut it down to size. These frames are just pieces of 2x6 butt jointed together. I've even got some screws running into the end grain, which is something you typically would not want to do, but these are also going to be locked to the wall. Those screws are really just there to hold it together while I assemble it. I used a speed square to hold these at 90 degrees while I screwed them together. The piece for the footboard overlapped the end grain of the side rails, and I wanted to hide those screws, so I used a countersink bit to drill those holes and then filled those holes with a piece of dowel. On the inside of the frame, I cut down some 2x2s to length and then jammed them in up against the outside rails. These were fully glued in place, and I added a lot of screws to really lock them into the 2x6. These pieces are going to support the slats on both sides of the bed, so they definitely need to be strong. They're going to be carrying all the weight of the mattress and the person in the bed. I added some glue and then shoved a dowel into the countersunk hole. I used a flush cut saw to cut it off, and then a hammer to knock it the rest of the way in. Then I got out my handy orbital sander and went over all of the surfaces to get rid of any of the printing on the wood, but also round over any of the corners and get rid of any rough spots. And while I finished sanding, Josh started on the next one. I cut down some 1x4s for the slats for these beds, and since I'm making 4 beds and I wanted to make sure that there was plenty of support, I had a whole lot of slats to cut. After making and sanding the other 2 frames, I went over all 4 of the frames with a couple of coats of polyacrylic. This is a water-based finish that I really like. It's super easy to put on. In this part of the room, there's an air return that's built into the baseboard, but the hole for it is actually in the floor. I need to make sure that that stays open and can draw in air from the room, so I'm going to pull this off and cut a larger hole in the floor so I can drop in this type of register. This will be underneath the bed, and then I need to cut a hole in the side of the bed to let some air flow in. I do want to point out that the only reason I can do it this way is that this return goes through a chase in the floor, so in between the joists. If you have a regular vent line running to this, you would have to do it very differently. Since the top bunk of these is going to be locked to the wall, the bottom also had to be in the exact same position. So in this case, I had to cut out the trim to make it fit right up against the drywall. But this really isn't a big deal. If we ever want to move the beds, trim is a really easy thing to replace. Once I got this frame pressed fully into the corner, I just added a couple of screws to tie it into the framing of the wall. And for the upper bunk, I used a stud finder to mark every single one of the studs on both of the walls that it was going to touch, so that I knew all the places I could screw into. To make it easier to mount the top frame, I cut down a few spacer pieces, one of which had some feet that would wrap around the 2x6 to hold it in place. This let us set the top frame in place and not have to worry about holding it while we got it level. Once I got it level in both directions, I used the marks that I had made on the studs to drill holes through the 2x6, through the studs in the wall, then I used some long lag bolts with washers to lock it into place. Next up, it was time to make the ladders, which also act as the support for the open end of the bed. This was made from tons of small pieces of black iron pipe, and I will say that this is not a very cheap option. This stuff ended up being way more expensive than I expected. But the good thing is that it comes in a bunch of different sizes already, and you can always get it cut to length and threaded at the home center. I've got the two halves of the ladder put together, but one thing you may not think about is that you can't actually thread these pieces into this side once everything is assembled. So we're gonna have to come up with another way to attach these rungs to this side of the ladder. I started out with a grinding disc, thinking that if I got rid of the threads, I could probably just press it into the other side. It turns out that it was still too big, so I used a belt grinder to really grind it down and make this part of the metal really thin. And once I had it thin enough, they could all fit in. It was just a matter of lining them all up and knocking them into place. There was a little bit of taper on each one of these, so once you knocked it in place, it really got pretty tight and in there. Some of these didn't quite go in, so I used a piece of wood to knock them in place rather than a hammer so that I didn't damage the finish of the pipe. On the inside of the frame, we used a washer and a nut with a nylon insert so it definitely stayed in place. I knocked out the support and of course had to test it out, and it was plenty sturdy. The rest of the upper rail screwed on in the exact same way, and I attached the flange to the side of the bed just like I had done with the ladder. Black iron pipe is covered with a coating to stop it from rusting, but this stuff gets everywhere and makes a huge mess. Luckily, my friend Ben Ueda from Homemade Modern made a video all about cleaning this pipe. Based on his video, I chose mineral spirits and steel wool to clean it off and paste wax to seal it. There's a lot of grunt work here to get it clean and get it sealed, but eventually it's perfectly clean to the touch and works really well. Check out Ben's video, I'll link it down below. And here's a shot of the frames and the ladders all in place. At this point, it's safe and secure to climb on, but it's not finished. Next up, it was time for the storage/headboard for each one of the beds. I made these so that each pair of beds has one unit that'll slide in place, provide the headboard and shelving from the outside. This was all made out of 3/4 inch plywood and really easy to put together. I used pocket holes where it made sense, brads in different places, but the whole thing was a very, very simple construction. I didn't want any screw holes visible from the side of the bed, so I added pocket holes to the ends of all these shelving pieces, then added some glue and drove in screws from the inside to lock it into the outer panel. The top shelf met up with this side panel. That was really easy, but getting the bottom one to sit on top of the bed frame was a little bit different. I added a scrap of 2x6 at the bottom and then used that as a reference point to set the bottom shelf in place. Once I had it in place, I traced out the lines so I knew where to add some glue. I got some glue on these pieces and screwed it together just like the top one. To split the big shelf into 3 small cubbies, I just measured it, divided that by 3, and made some marks. I slid in some panels that I had cut down with some glue to hold them in place. But before the glue setup, I made sure to square them up to the top and the bottom panels. And even though we were planning on painting these, I added some edge banding to the front of this plywood. The edge grain of plywood like that soaks up paint pretty badly and never looks very smooth. Adding this edge banding is pretty easy and quick to do, and makes it look like a solid piece of wood, especially once it's painted. This stuff is super easy to put on with a regular iron, and it's very easy to trim off with a sharp knife or a block plane. I found that using a foam sanding block with a really fine sandpaper on it was a great way to get a nice transition between the banding and the outer ply of the plywood. I got both of these units painted white, and originally we were gonna leave the back of the shelves open so you could see the wall color behind it. But of course, right at the very end, we've decided to make a small change. We decided we wanted to put different colors behind the shelves on each one of the beds, and I wanted to come up with kind of a temporary way to do that. And what I came up with was this. I got some really thin strips of material. We're gonna glue them down right at the bottom shelf and then be able to drop in a panel from the top that has color painted on it. That way, when my kids' tastes change or they swap beds, we can pull the panels out and change them up. This is probably unique to our situation, but I had to cut a hole in the side panel to add an air register to. This is an air return to get air back into the AC system, and since I removed it from the wall, I had to extend it out to here. When the shelving units were all finished up, they set right into place on top of the frames. I drove in a few screws from the inside of the frames to lock them together, and then they were pretty much done. One side of the room is a little bit smaller than the other one, so I did have to remove the window trim and cut it down to fit. The last little piece was to cut down my colored boards into the right size pieces and drop them into place. One thing that's really cool about this idea is you could put anything on these panels. In our case, we even painted the backside a different color so that you could pull them out, flip them over, and get a totally different palette. There they are. This is a very basic project. The construction is really simple, using simple materials that you can get at any home center, and it is extremely sturdy. And we'll find out how strong they are over time. I've got 3 growing boys, and so these are gonna be beds slash jungle gym slash everything else. After I got them completely finished, there is one thing that I figured out that I'm gonna have to change a little bit, and it's really based on the size of my kids. The gap right here is a little bit larger than I expected it to be with the mattress in place, and so there is a slight chance that a kid could slide in this gap and fall out. It's pretty unlikely, but just to be safe, I'm gonna come back and add another bar right across there. If you have a teenager on a bed like this, or even a larger kid, I don't think that's really an issue, but my kids are still pretty small. We've got several other really cool things planned for this room. I've got several projects lined up to turn this into an ultimate little boys room. It's gonna be awesome. I'd love to know what you think about these beds. Let me know down in the comments below, and if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them down there as well. Don't forget to check the description as well, because I've got a list of all my tools, a lot of the supplies, and special links to the specialty things that are in this project. I've also got tons of other projects that you may be interested in, lots of different types of stuff, so be sure to check some of those out, and don't forget to subscribe. That's it for this one, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. And just so you don't think our house is actually this clean, it's not. Today I'm gonna make I actually didn't mean to do that.